Hello, this is Dr. K. In this video, we're going to add entity classes and session beans to our AffableBean project. To do this, we're going to make use of two important wizards in NetBeans: the Entity Classes from Database wizard and the Session Beans for Entity Classes wizard. The first wizard, Entity Classes from Database, creates a Java persistence or entity class for each database table. Entity classes contain fields that correspond to the fields of the table they represent, and they have getter and setter methods for each field. Each entity, that is, each instance or object, corresponds to a record or row in the table that the class represents. Session beans that correspond to entity classes have, by default, the basic database CRUD functionality for entities, that is, create, read, update, and delete. This can and probably should be modified to reflect the needs of your application. For the AffableBean application, we're going to keep the default behavior. Recall that in the model view controller diagram we saw earlier in this tutorial, session beans and entity classes were part of the model. Each entity class represents a table in the database, and instances represent rows or potential rows in that table. These objects can be automatically stored in the database using a technique called Object Relational Mapping, or ORM. The session beans encapsulate the business logic of the application. In our application, they will be facade classes that enable CRUD access to entities. But in general, they can contain any operations that are relevant to your application. A Java application server like Glassfish consists not only of a web container that manages servlets and JSP pages, but also an EJB container that manages EJBs and related technologies. In fact, this is a bit of an oversimplification because as of EJB 3, the Java Persistence API became its own specification and can be used independently of an EJB container. Since enterprise Java beans are meant for enterprise applications, we should define what we mean by that. According to Technopedia, an enterprise application is a large software system that is designed to operate in a corporate environment. As such, the system is typically complex, distributed, and mission-critical. To achieve these properties and still be reliable, the system should also be component-based and therefore scalable. We've talked a lot about the model view controller architecture, but sometimes when enterprise applications are discussed, they're talked about in terms of layered architectures. In a layered architecture, each layer or tier has a well-defined task, and it passes the remaining work to the layer below it. Here, the presentation layer is the user interface. It may be a browser or a desktop application. The business logic layer defines the business rules. The persistence layer deals with interactions with the database. And the database layer consists of a relational database like MySQL that stores the persistent objects. In the book EJB 3 in Action, they discuss the technologies at the different layers. Java Server Faces is used in the presentation layer. Since we're not using the JSF framework, our presentation layer will consist of servlets and JSP. Enterprise Java beans comprise the business logic layer. Java Persistence API is used in the persistence layer, and a relational database management system is used in the database layer. The reason that enterprise Java beans are so desirable is because Enterprise applications often require certain features, and many of these features are built in to the EJB framework. Furthermore, you can activate many of these features as necessary simply by providing the correct annotations. Here's a list of some of the most important features. Security through simple configuration, asynchronous processing, remote accessibility, SOAP or REST web services with minimal changes. All components are transactional, integrated, objects can be pulled easily, components are thread safe, you can schedule components easily, and you can easily do message processing. Now, we're not going to use all of these features in our AffableBean application, but they're there if we need them. So, Enterprise Java Beans are server-side components that you use to build the business logic layer of your application. One of the nice things about EJB 3, as opposed to earlier versions of EJB, is the move towards having EJB components be as close to plain old Java objects as possible. Sometimes you'll see that expression, plain old Java objects, abbreviated as POJO or POJO. The special services we talked about in the previous slide are added with annotations. In this way, the services don't distract from the central purpose of the component. These are some of the special services we'll be using in the AffableBean application. We've already talked about pooling when we talked about setting up a connection pool for the database. A pool of EJB instances is maintained so that they can be reused by other clients. This saves on the overhead of object creation, which can be even more expensive when special services are involved. Thread safety is another useful feature. All EJB components are thread safe, and performance optimizations associated with thread safety are built into the EJB container. Since we will have transactions in our application, we'll make use of the transaction management features of EJB components. If a transactional method completes normally, the transaction is committed and any data changes are made permanent. If the transaction method does not complete normally for any reason at all, the transaction is rolled back. Finally, security is an essential part of the application. EJB allows you to configure your security settings the way you like, and the framework takes care of the details. To recap, Enterprise Java Beans are plain old Java objects that you can add special services to by using annotations. There are two main EJB types, session beans and message-driven beans. Message-driven beans are triggered by messages sent to a message server. They are used for sending asynchronous messages between system components. We're not going to be dealing with message-driven beans in our application, but you should be aware of them. Session beans are invoked by a client to perform a specific operation. Once the operation or set of operations is complete, the bean is destroyed or returned to the EJB pool. Session beans come in three different flavors: stateful, stateless, and singleton. Just like plain old Java objects, stateful beans store the state in their instance variables. And that state is maintained across multiple method calls until the business operation or unit of work has been completed. Stateless beans are used for operations that can be completed by using a single method call. And singleton beans maintain the state and are shared by all clients. Singleton beans live for the duration of the application. In this portion of the AffableBean tutorial, we're going to create EJBs that are associated with specific tables in the database and that provide basic CRUD database operations for records in those tables. Since the operations mirror basic database operations, the EJBs that we create will be stateless session beans. A typical session bean executes on behalf of a single client. It's transaction aware, and it updates shared data in an underlying database. The session beans do not represent the data in the database. That is what entity classes do. Note that entity classes are associated with the Java Persistence API. A typical session is also relatively short-lived. It is removed when the EJB container crashes or is stopped, and the client must recreate a new session object in order to continue the business operation they were trying to accomplish.